Welcome back to the Deep Dive, everyone, and especially to all those who are getting ready for the UPSC exams. This is part 2 of our Modern Indian History series. So if you haven't already listened to our previous episode, make sure you catch up. And if you're finding these deep dives helpful, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and give us a like. Today we're going to explore a really interesting and a crucial aspect of British rule in India, their efforts to control the press in 19th century India.
It's really fascinating what's particularly intriguing about this period. It wasn't simply just censorship. It was a battle over India's narrative. The British, they were deeply worried about how much power the press had to shape public opinion, especially, when it came to anti-colonial sentiment.
So they kind of saw the press as like a weapon that could be turned against them.
Precisely. To fully understand what motivated them, we need to think about 19th century India. It was a time of just immense social and political upheaval. The press, especially vernacular publications, they were becoming more vocal, more critical of British policies.
Yeah, it makes sense. So how did they go about doing this? Did they just like ban anything they didn't agree with?
Well, it was a little more complicated than that. They put into place a whole bunch of laws and acts, each with its own its own mechanisms for control. A good place to start is the Censorship Act of 1799. This one was enacted under the governorship of Richard Wellesley.
Oh, Wellesley. Right, known for his expansionist policies and his, let's say, firm grip on power. What did this Censorship Act actually involve?
Well, basically, it was pre-publication censorship. Think about it. Before you could even print a single copy of your newspaper, pamphlet, whatever, you had to submit your manuscript to the government, and they reviewed it. And anything that they considered seditious, basically anything critical of British rule, was just banned. Imagine how much that just shut down writers and publishers, especially the ones who were brave enough to disagree.
Yeah, it must have been so frustrating for those who are trying to speak their minds freely. And really disheartening, too, knowing your work might just get suppressed even before it got out to the public.
Absolutely. This act, it silenced a lot of powerful voices, especially from those who were already marginalized. It shows how far the British were willing to go to stop anyone who opposed their rule.
So how did the Indian press respond? Did they just accept this heavy-handed censorship, or did they find ways to fight back?
Oh, they were incredibly resilient and creative, even when they were facing such strict control. But before we get into that, let's move on to the next big attempt at controlling the press. The Licensing Act of 1823.
Okay, so this comes after the Censorship Act. Was it even stricter?
Well, in some ways, it was even more sneaky because it targeted the publications themselves, their very existence. This act said that any printing press, any publication had to get a license from the government to even operate. And, get this, these licenses could be taken away at any moment. It basically gave the British the power to just shut down any publication they didn't like.
Wow, that's a serious tool of control.
Yeah.
Can you give us an example of how this actually affected the Indian press?
Oh, yeah. A big example is Ramahan Roy. He was a major figure in the Bengal Renaissance. He had this publication called Merat-ul-Akhbar. It was super influential at the time, advocating for things like social reform and religious tolerance. But it was shut down in 1823 because of this very act.
So it wasn't just about silencing dissent. It was about, like, controlling the flow of ideas, even if those ideas were about positive change, even those promoting social reform weren't safe.
Exactly. And there's another crucial point here. The Licensing Act of 1823, it really went after Indian language publications specifically. The goal was to cut down on their influence and stop them from reaching the masses.
Oh, that's a big point. It really shows that the British were particularly worried about vernacular publications, about them mobilizing people, potentially challenging their power. But wait, didn't things change for the better with the Press Act of 1835?
Yeah, you're right. That's a really interesting turning point in this whole story. The Press Act of 1835, it's also known as Metcalfe's reforms, it actually did bring in a bit of a freer period for the Indian press. It repealed those tight restrictions of the Licensing Act, which was a huge relief for Indian publishers and journalists.
That sounds almost too good to be true. What caused this sudden shift towards a freer press? Was there a change in British policy, or did they realize that their heavy-handed approach wasn't working?
The guy behind this change was Charles Metcalfe. He was the acting governor general. And he had a totally different view of the press. He believed that a free press, even if it sometimes criticized the government, could actually help with good governance. He saw it as a kind of safety valve, allowing people to air their grievances and making the public more informed.
That's interesting. It seems like even within the British administration, there were different ideas on how to handle the press. Metcalfe's way of thinking was pretty progressive for his time.
Yeah, it was a bold move, and it had a major impact on the development of the Indian press. All of a sudden, journalists and publishers had more freedom to express themselves, critique policies, and just engage in public discourse. You see, during this period, there was a surge in the number of publications, especially vernacular newspapers, and they played a huge role in shaping public opinion and national consciousness.
It must have felt like a huge relief for those who had been working under such strict control for so long. But, as we know, history is full of twists and turns. Did this new freedom last?
Unfortunately, not really. Things were about to change again, and the press would find itself back in a struggle back and forth between control and resistance. Things were about to change again.
Yeah, and the press would find itself caught, back in that struggle between control and resistance.
So what happened? What brought that period of openness to an end? Well, the 1857 revolt, it had a massive impact on British policies, really, including, of course, how they approached the press. That uprising, that revolt, it really shook the foundations of British rule in India. It led to a lot of fear, a lot of paranoia within the British administration.
It makes sense that they'd want to clamp down on information after something like that, after such a big challenge to their authority.
Exactly, and that's what they did. In 1857, Lord Canning, he was the Governor General then, he introduced this new Licensing Act, and it basically undid a lot of the freedoms that Metcalfe had put in place. This act, it brought back the licensing requirements. It gave the government the power to censor anything they thought was seditious. They even banned anything about the mutiny itself, couldn't publish anything related to it.
Wow, so it was like a complete 180 from Metcalfe's more liberal way of doing things.
Yeah.
What was the thinking behind such a harsh move? Were they really that scared of the press?
The British, they saw the press, particularly those vernacular publications, as a real threat, a tool that could be used to stir up rebellion, spread anti-British feelings. They felt they needed stricter control to keep things in order, to prevent more uprisings from happening. And this fear, it was made worse by the fact that, yes, some parts of the Indian press did play a role in getting support for the rebellion.
So it was a reaction, really driven by fear and that need to take back control. How did Indian journalists and publishers handle this new crackdown? Did they just give in, or did they find ways to resist?
This is where you really see the incredible spirit of the Indian press. They were so resilient, so resourceful. They faced these new restrictions, but they came up with all sorts of strategies to get around the censorship and still get their views out there. They used satire, allegory, even coded language to criticize the British without breaking the law directly. Some publications, they even moved, relocated to princely states where the press laws weren't so tight.
So they got even more creative, even more determined in their efforts. It's almost like a game, right?
Yeah.
Cat and mouse. The British trying to shut down any disagreement, and Indian journalists and publishers finding new ways to fight back.
You got it. It was this constant battle, back and forth, a real testament to those who believed in a free press. And it's important to remember, this fight, it wasn't just about freedom of expression. It was about shaping the story of India, the narrative itself.
That's a great point. Whoever controls the story controls how people see things. The British, they were trying to hold on to their version of events, their justification for being there, for colonial rule. But Indian journalists and publishers were working to show another side, a perspective that challenged the British and called for Indian self-rule.
Exactly right. And that struggle, it's had a lasting effect. It shaped how Indian journalism developed and even how we think about press freedom today.
So thinking about this period, what are some key takeaways, especially for those studying for the UPSC? How can understanding this fight for the Indian press help us understand modern Indian history? And how does it connect to today?
Well, there are a few important things to learn from this. First, it really highlights how vital the press is in shaping public opinion, mobilizing movements, challenging those in power. The press, it's always been a force for change, social and political. And its history in India, it really proves that.
Yeah, it's a force for change, and its history in India, it really proves that.
It's a reminder, too, that that fight for a free press, it never really ends. It's an ongoing battle, and it needs us to be, vigilant and to think critically, to challenge those who are trying to control the flow of information. It is, absolutely. And the second thing is, this period, it really emphasizes how crucial media literacy is. If you understand the history of how the press was controlled, it can help you to evaluate information critically, to spot biases, to figure out, what's true and what's propaganda. This is super important now in this digital age. We're just flooded with information from all over the place.
So it's not just about memorizing the dates and names. It's about understanding, how those facts relate to what's going on today. How can we take the lessons from that era, and apply them to the world of information and media that we live in now?
That's the big question, isn't it? And lastly, this time period, it reminds us how powerful ideas can be and how resilient the human spirit is, even when faced with oppression. Even though they had such strict restrictions, Indian journalists and publishers, they never gave up that fight for a free press. It shows how dedicated they were to truth, to justice, to the power of words. Their legacy, it's inspiring, even today, as we try to navigate this crazy world of information and media.
It is inspiring. It really shows that, even when things seem impossible, that pursuit of truth and freedom of expression, it can't be silenced. Okay, as we're wrapping up this deep dive into the battle for the Indian press, let's kind of bring it all together. We've gone through this whole century, all these changes. Strict censorship in the early 1800s, then that short time of freedom under Metcalfe, and then back to even tighter control after the 1857 revolt. What does all this tell us about, who had the power and how they used it, and how does it connect to our world now?
It's amazing how the main issues haven't really changed, right? That need to control information, to shape the stories people believe, to shut down voices that disagree. Those are fights that keep happening throughout history and, even today.
It's like we're seeing a new version of this same battle happening online now. Think about all the talk about censorship on social media, misinformation spreading everywhere,
Yeah.
the influence of those algorithms. It's a whole new world, but, those power dynamics feel very familiar.
Yes, exactly. And that's why knowing this history is so important. It gives us a way to understand how information is controlled, how stories are built, how power works, even in places that seem democratic.
So for everyone listening, especially those getting ready for the UPSC, what are some of the big things they can take away from this? How can they use this knowledge to understand modern India and the world as a whole?
Well, one of the most important lessons is this. The fight for a free press is never really over. It's something we have to constantly work at. It takes us being watchful, thinking critically, and being willing to stand up to those who want to control what information gets out.
It's about recognizing that information is power, right? And whoever has that information, they have a huge amount of influence over society. And it's about knowing the tactics they use. Censorship, propaganda, subtly shaping the way people see things.
You're right. And for those UPSC aspirants, this knowledge is really important for them. It deepens their understanding of modern Indian history. It gives them insights into how Indian society, politics, and culture have evolved.
Yeah, it's not just about memorizing facts and dates. It's about understanding those deeper forces that have shaped India's past and how those forces still affect things today. And it's about learning to think critically so you can analyze complicated historical events and see how they connect to what's happening now.
Precisely. And maybe the most inspiring thing we can take away from all of this is how resilient those people were who fought for a free press in India. Even when it was really hard, they understood that ideas have power, that truth is important, and that every person has the right to know what's going on and to speak their mind.
Their story is powerful. It shows us that even when we face huge obstacles, the pursuit of a free and open society, it never ends. It needs courage, dedication, and belief that people's voices can challenge injustice and create a better world.
Well said. And with that, I think we've come to the end of our deep dive.
We have. And it's been an enlightening one. To all our listeners, I hope this has made you curious and helped you understand a bit more about history, how complex it is, and how relevant it is to today's world. Remember, a critical understanding of the past is essential for navigating the present and shaping the future. And don't forget, if you enjoyed this deep dive, please subscribe and give us a like. We'll see you next time. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those brains engaged.